there has been a centralization of actual political power and policy authority in the United States over time. And that hasn't really abated. This Supreme Court has started to chip away at that in ways, some of which are exciting, like the end of Chevron deference, so that, oh, if you're the unelected bureaucrat that's interpreted a vague statute, the court just doesn't bow before you like a mini king.
Yes.
But has to actually do its job.
Yeah.
That seems like a step in the right direction. How do you think about the mechanism of politics starting to reflect the decentralization of knowledge and expertise? Because that's kind of how I'm hearing what you're saying, that we're actually seeing, in the best possible sense, decentralization of expertise.
I think there's two. I think it's both centralization and decentralization occurring at the same time. So if we just take the big example of Twitter and now rebranded X, I'm a huge supporter of what Elon Musk has been doing. I was a Twitter Files journalist. I've written on, there's been some controversial edge cases around India and Turkey where censorship was demanded of them. I was involved in one in Brazil. He did the right thing on Brazil. And he's also, they're trying to get along with different power centers, particularly the advertisers demand a lot of censorship. And so just recently there was a congressional hearing, actually yesterday there was a congressional hearing, Ben Shapiro testified about the ways in which the advertisers collude to deprive conservative and libertarian or disfavored outlets of funding, and they're exercising control in that way. And is that legal? Is it ethical? What is it? The big change here is that X is now a much more free speech platform than it was. It's not 100%, but that's not really possible. The problem is that we're really now dependent on one man to stay strong with us. And I was actually I'm not an electric car guy at all. I'm not a rocket guy either. But I was very happy that Elon Musk got that $46 billion bonus payment, because I was like, well, that covers his loss on Twitter and more. And so there's he's less vulnerable to the financial pressures to censor. On the other hand, I don't love it that our free speech rights depend on a single person. Just as a principle, it doesn't matter who the person is,
It is a kind of benevolent monarchism.
He's the king. I mean, he's a king. It's a monarchy. So I believe in the First Amendment, which says as a spiritual and moral matter that free speech comes before the government. Government doesn't give us free speech rights. We have free speech rights that are inalienable to us as human beings. That's very clear in our founding documents. And then we affirm the government should exist, but free speech comes first. What does that mean in the age of the internet? I mean, for me, what I have argued is that the distinction in the law between publishers and social media platforms gives special rights to the social media platforms, special liability protections.
This is Section 230?
Section 230, 1996 Communication Decency Act. My view is that if you're going to be a social media platform, then you should have as a rule that you're going to allow adult users to decide on their own legal content. So obviously what kids get should be up to their parents, in some ways restricted. I think illegal content that we all agree should be censored without question, but that adult users should decide. Is that what we have now at X? We're getting there, a little closer. I'd feel better if that were the law that required that. On the other hand, and I've testified on it, and I've told Elon what I think, there's no movement towards implementing Michael Schellenberger's proposal on this, which some might call a common carrier proposal, but I would just call it, adult user control of legal content. No one's moving towards that, and I'm not pushing it aggressively, in part because so far it's looking pretty good on X. But yeah, if you get to a place where suddenly Elon's replaced, or he loses his mind or whatever, and he starts to become more censorious,
dies in a car accident,
something happens, heaven forbid, I would then worry about it, because I do feel like, and people accuse me of exaggerating, but I do feel like if you don't have X, you really are in a more totalitarian type situation, because the censorship on Facebook is it's just insane. TikTok censors you if you refuse to go along with the company line that people can change their biological sex, which is absurd. And so where is the free speech platform? I mean, traditional media, it's just all the problems with traditional media. So you only really have X. And in the case of Brazil, you had the Supreme Court a single justice out of control that was trying to not just censor people, but to ban them. Politicians, and we're talking about politicians and journalists, which is career death. I mean, that's it. If you can't be on social media platforms, he wanted to ban them entirely. Well, if that were to occur, you're in a totalitarian situation. So on the one hand, I think we're in a really dangerous, fragile moment. On the other hand, I'm a little bit more relaxed. We also lost a Supreme Court thing, which we don't need to go into, but basically that's kind of where we're at.
The Missouri case?
Yeah, the Missouri case. I mean, that's kind of where we're at, is that please God protect Elon Musk. And also at some point, I would love to see a stronger foundation for our free speech protections.
It's funny you'd mentioned common carrier. Yesterday I had Randy Barnett, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he's one of the sort of leading intellectual architects of originalism. He's also basically like an anarcho-libertarian minded person. So he's like simultaneously he's like a radical and been effective in having an impact on legal thought on the conservative / libertarian side of the spectrum, the Federalist Society,
Right.
etc.
Right.
And he made a similar argument. We didn't dive super deep, but he was basically saying that, like, look, this issue of are you a common carrier? Are you in a platform position where there's other things happening? I'm not sure quite. I haven't grappled with this enough to think about fully, like, what are the criteria? Is it about network effects? Is it about infrastructure? Because, I think some of the arguments historically were, well, once you've run the telephone lines, it's really, really expensive. It involves all kinds of complex property rights and eminent domain. So you no longer have, by virtue of the physical infrastructure, easy entrance and exit.
Right.
And so we need to have some essentially regulation.
Right.
In the form of common carrier. I mean, it is a regulatory regime to say, oh, you're going to build this platform, but you have to abide by these rules.
Right. Yes. Well, I mean, you basically just described this very long argument that had existed before the internet and the social media had risen to power, and now we're coming back to it. But yeah, I mean, it's called a natural monopoly. And it first starts with the electrical grid. Something because I work on energy, it was a very known thing where, I mean, you don't want to have like 5 companies stringing electrical wire to every house. I mean, it's insane. And then you choose which company. I mean, it's so total. Everybody recognizes a waste of resource. So it was a natural monopoly in the sense it made sense for it to be a monopoly. And then you have these regulated monopoly utilities, and they can either be government owned or they can be private. But either way, they're really heavily regulated, so they can't price gouge. They can't just be like, or they can't deprive you service because you're a libertarian. They can't say, we're not going to provide electrical service to you because you're a libertarian.
Some people want that.
Yeah. So then the question is, so everyone's accepted that on electricity markets. I mean, for the most part, there was some, it doesn't matter. There's some tangents there. But then you get to the social media platforms and you go, well, are there network effects? And even Jack Dorsey, the creator of Twitter, has been sort of a denier of these network effects. So they go, we're going to go do decentralization. So we're going to go do, I think this was Blue Sky, and there's one called Mastodon, there's one called Nostr.
Yeah, sort of federated.
Yeah, you kind of go, and when I'm an open-minded guy. I mean, I'm skeptical because I think network effects are very real. I mean, they're dead. Like, you go there and you're like, well, that post has 0 views and 0 likes and whatever. And meanwhile, like, X is just like, I mean, even Threads, which is the new Twitter clone that Facebook did, it's also like they're throttling the social and political news. So there's really nothing like X Twitter that gets you this intense, like, just density of information and virality. And so the virality is this new thing. And interestingly enough, the people that want more censorship are also obsessed with virality. Like, virality is like the main event in some ways, because if you're viral, then you're actually reaching a lot of people and you're changing opinion, and it's also how you make a business, and there's all sorts of reasons to be concerned about that. How do you get virality on these decentralized networks? I don't think it'll ever happen. I mean, that's my own personal view of it. Hence my view that you need that condition, that if you're going to have this social media status. But it's complicated because I'll tell you the other complicated thing. When you open up your New York Times app now on your iPhone or your smartphone, what's so interesting is that in the lower right-hand corner, there's a little blue notifications signal that looks identical to the little blue notifications on Twitter. And we're such basic animals. Like, you open up and you go, look, I got notifications. So I think the New York Times in particular is becoming more like a platform, and then the platforms like Twitter are becoming more like publishers. And so I've been encouraging this trend that, I mean, so you see on Twitter, you can now publish articles, and the format looks a little bit more like Substack, and they really believe in this and they want to do that. And I've been encouraging them to have like paywalls, and so you can make money. So you're starting to see a blurring of the line between publisher and social media platform, which just makes it even more complicated. And actually, I think kind of in some ways, I don't know if it undermines my argument, but it certainly complicates my argument for what I think we ought to do. But I don't know what else to say. I just describe what I'm seeing to policymakers and others, and I think that they're kind of like, let's just see how this all shakes out a little bit right now. The other observation I was going to make is that I think in a moment when you have this high level of polarization and nothing's been able to happen in Congress, you have seen more reliance on the Supreme Court. And I think to some extent, I think it's been wonderful. And I think that some of the Supreme Court decisions, I agree with the Chevron decision, for example, but I also agree with the decision they made on homelessness. They just made a decision that the local cities can clear homeless encampments. But it was also a decision where I was like, that only went to the Supreme Court because they're not able to deal with this problem. But like the Supreme Court, like homelessness needs to be dealt with, and I don't want to overstate its complexity, but I wrote a whole book on it, and obviously I think it requires a whole set of things. Supreme Court, that's not their job. They don't write policy. They're mostly out there to say, yes, you can do that. No, you can't. So I do think, though, that in a kind of legitimation crisis and also a political crisis, a governance crisis, things are going to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court can be like, yeah, yes or no, but we can't solve that problem. That has to be solved by government.